county map was altered 10 days before I arrived, with my land quietly stolen on paper. The morning I moved into my family's old lake lodge, the HOA stormed my dock like they were raiding a crime scene. I hadn't even unpacked my tools before they shoved papers in my face, demanding I leave their shoreline. But deep down, I knew something was off. And by the time the truth came out, the whole community would learn exactly who the legal owner really was. If you've ever stood your ground against the wrong kind of power, drop a 1 in the comments. And hit subscribe for more real land justice stories just like this. The first thing Elias Mercer noticed that morning wasn't the cold, it was the quiet. Pine Hollow Lake didn't wake up with alarms or engines. It breathed. A thin layer of fog drifted over the water like a sheet pulled slowly off a sleeping giant, and the pine trees stood still, waiting for the sun to crest the ridge. Elias stepped out of his pickup and let the chill settle into his jacket. After 15 years working on remote dam sites, always somewhere loud, dusty, and humming with tension, this silence felt like an overdue apology from life itself. He set his coffee on the truck's tailgate and tugged the tarp off a stack of lumber he brought for repairs. The lodge stood about 30 yards ahead, weathered but stubborn, built from Montana timber thick enough to outlast 4 generations. Its windows reflected the slow-spreading sunrise across the lake. Elias breathed in the scent of wet earth, lake water, and old cedar. This place was supposed to be his reset button, his first real home after years of living out of motels and bunkhouses, a place where he could mend both the roof and whatever was left of his peace. He didn't hear the footsteps at first, not because they were quiet, but because they were sharp, aggressive, purposeful. Footsteps that didn't belong to dawn or lakes or peace. They belonged to confrontation. The fog split as a figure marched toward him down the shoreline, heels stabbing the damp dirt as if scolding the land itself. A woman in a bright wool coat, hair pinned tight enough to stop circulation, and a clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. Madeline Stroud. He didn't know her name yet. But the moment he saw the glare on her face, tight jaw, narrowed eyes, neck stiff with authority, he knew exactly what category she belonged to. Someone used to being obeyed without question. "You!" she barked before she was even within arm's reach, the word slicing through the quiet like a thrown knife. "You cannot begin construction without HOA review and approval. This entire area is under our jurisdiction." Elias blinked. "Morning to you too." Madeline ignored the greeting, thrusting a stack of papers toward his chest. The pages shook, not from fear, but from indignation so practiced it had muscle memory. Her voice climbed higher with each accusation. "Unapproved dock maintenance, unauthorized lumber delivery, illegal shoreline modification. And you've been here," she flicked her eyes at her watch, "less than an hour." Elias didn't touch the papers. He just took another sip of coffee, the steam curling into the cold air. "Ma'am, I'm just unloading my truck." "That is construction," she snapped. "And construction violates Section 12, Article D of the Pine Hollow Lakeside Homeowners Association Charter, revised this month. You are in violation and subject to immediate fines." He exhaled slowly, letting the warmth of the coffee steady him. He had faced flash floods, collapsed spillways, and engineers who thought yelling was a leadership technique. He wasn't about to lose his temper over a clipboard. But irritation tightened in his chest anyway, rising like the wind that rippled across the lake. "I think there's been some mistake," Elias said. "This property isn't under HOA jurisdiction." Madeline's eyes widened, not in surprise but offense. "Everything on this eastern shore is under HOA jurisdiction. We expanded the boundary lines for environmental compliance. It's all here." She shook the pages again. "Signed and authorized." He finally took the papers, only because she pushed them closer to his face than oxygen. They were fresh prints, not even fully dry, showing new property lines sketched in thick red marker. His lodge, his shoreline, his dock, his driveway, all boxed into a sudden and suspicious new HOA district. Elias lowered the papers. How can you own land my family's held since 1934? Madeline's expression tightened so sharply it could have cut glass. She wasn't expecting resistance. Not at dawn. Not from a man she assumed didn't know the rules she wrote herself. We own what we say we own, she said, voice clipped. And if you don't comply, we will pursue removal. Removal. On the first morning, before breakfast, before he even had a chance to breathe in the promise of this place. The fog rolled off the lake a little more, revealing the dock's dark silhouette extending into the still water. For a moment, Elias wondered how many mornings his grandfather had looked across this same scene. Quiet lake, steady wood, mountains holding the world together behind it all. How many years this land had stayed untouched by drama and paperwork, and why suddenly, now, someone was desperate to claim it. Madeline stepped closer. Too close. This lodge is a liability to the community. You will stop all activity immediately. Elias met her stare. Calm, level, quiet, as the lake behind him. Madeline, is it? He asked. Mrs. Stroud, she corrected. Mrs. Stroud, why are you so desperate to control one old lodge? Her jaw tightened. Her eyes flicked, just for a second, toward the water. And that tiny glance, quick as a bird's shadow, told Elias one crucial thing. This wasn't about construction. This wasn't about noise. This wasn't about the HOA charter. This was about something else. Something the lake was hiding. Something his lodge stood on top of. Something the HOA wanted more than they wanted fairness or truth. The wind shifted. The fog thinned. And for the first time since arriving, Elias felt it. This place wasn't quiet at all. It was holding its breath. Elias felt that truth settle in his bones as Madeline Stroud's heels clicked back up the shoreline like a warning bell. The fog drifted away behind her, but her presence lingered, sharp, cold, and sour as metal left out in the rain. He watched her disappear behind the curve of the pines before folding the suspicious HOA papers and tucking them into his jacket. The lake rippled lightly at his side, as if urging him to look deeper, to listen. He did what he always did when something didn't fit. He returned to his truck, leaned against the door, and stared out at the water with the eyes of a man trained to notice structural cracks before the rest of the world did. The lake looked calm, but the outlines of the land on those printed maps were still burning in his mind. Too clean, too recent, too bold for a legitimate filing. He had only lifted his coffee again when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Montana area code. He almost let it ring. Almost. Mr. Mercer? A woman's voice asked, young, steady, and carrying the clipped rhythm of someone who spent too much time talking to government offices. This is Clara Pennington at the Pine County Clerk's office. I hope I'm not calling too early. Elias's eyes narrowed. No, ma'am, I'm up. How can I help you? There was a breath on the other end, one that sounded cautious, like she was checking if anyone was listening from her side of the line. We saw an HOA boundary update filed last week. I just wanted to confirm something before we lock it into the system. What kind of update? Elias asked, though his stomach already tightened. A jurisdiction expansion, Clara said. It includes several parcels on the East Shore, including, apparently, yours. Elias turned toward the lodge, its weathered beams and moss-covered roof catching the pale sunlight. That land is not under HOA control, he said quietly. Yes, Clara replied, which is why I'm calling. The document was submitted 10 days ago, and the signature doesn't match the usual filing officer. We're reviewing whether it's legitimate. She hesitated again, lowering her voice. Mr. Mercer, did you authorize any part of this? No, Elias answered. And the HOA president showed up this morning using that map as a weapon. The line went silent long enough for him to hear the soft tapping of Clara's fingers on a desk. I thought so, she said finally. Something about this filing felt rushed, forced. It's the first time they've tried to redraw boundaries without public notice. Elias rubbed his jaw. Why 10 days ago? Why right before I arrived? That's exactly the question. Papers shuffled faintly through the receiver. And the submission was done after hours, through a portal not used in typical filings. Elias stared at the red clay earth beneath his boots, replaying Madeline's tight expression, the way she clutched those papers like a lifeline, the way her eyes flashed when he questioned the legitimacy of her authority. This wasn't random, he murmured. No, Clara agreed. Someone wanted your land under HOA rule before you stepped foot on it. The wind picked up, rustling through the pines like a whisper. Elias looked back toward the dock, toward the water stretching out like a mirror reflecting the sky. What are they hiding? He muttered. I wish I knew, Clara said softly. But I'll keep digging on my end. I'll call you the moment I find anything. He thanked her and hung up. The phone felt heavier in his hand than it should have. 10 days. A suspicious boundary expansion, a forged signature, and an HOA president showing up at dawn like she'd been waiting for him. He walked down to the dock and stood at the edge, the boards creaking under his weight. The lake water lapped quietly against the posts, the rhythmic sound almost calming, if not for the gnawing pressure squeezing his chest. Something about the shoreline felt wrong, off, as if the land itself was bracing for impact. He crouched and ran his fingers across the old wooden planks, feeling grooves carved by decades of use. His grandfather had built part of this dock by hand. Elias remembered hearing stories of it, though he was too young then to appreciate them. A simple dock for simple living, a place where no one bothered you, where land and water didn't come with arguments or paperwork. Now someone wanted to erase those memories with red marker lines and forged authority. A distant engine growled behind him. He straightened and glanced toward the main road as a dark SUV rolled past slowly, windows tinted so black they swallowed the reflection of the sun. It didn't stop, it didn't need to. The message was in the hovering silence it left behind. An unspoken threat drifting through the morning air. By the time the vehicle disappeared past the tree line, Elias felt it again. The lake was holding its breath, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he felt something tighten in his ribs, an edge of unease he hadn't known in years. Because if someone was willing to forge official boundaries, if someone knew exactly when he'd arrive, if someone needed his land that badly, then this old lodge wasn't just a piece of property. It was leverage. It was power. And someone had decided it must fall under their control at any cost. Elias stood on the dock longer than he meant to, eyes scanning the calm water like it might blink back with secrets. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Whatever the HOA wanted, whatever plan they'd rushed into place, they had made one mistake. They assumed he'd fold. But after years of working on dam sites where one wrong decision could flood a valley, Elias had learned something about pressure. It didn't break him. It sharpened him. He turned toward the lodge and walked back up the dirt path, boots crunching on gravel, determination settling into his stride. If the HOA thought forged maps would intimidate him, they hadn't met a man who spent his life reading terrain for hidden fractures. He knew how to find cracks, and he knew how to follow them to the truth. As he reached the porch steps, the wind shifted again, brushing the trees with a shiver. The lake behind him grew still, almost unnaturally so. A warning, a question, a promise. And Elias understood that whatever the HOA was hiding, whatever they feared, he was about to uncover it. The next morning arrived without the quiet grace of the previous one. No fog drifting, no soft wind sliding across the lake. Instead, Elias opened the lodge door to a sharp slap of cold air and a bright yellow envelope nailed to the wooden railing like a warning flag. He peeled it off slowly, the paper stiff and brittle from frost. The bold red letters glared up at him. Notice of violation. Immediate action required. He exhaled through his nose, the steam clouding in front of him. He hadn't even touched a hammer yet. Inside the envelope were photocopies, crisp but poorly stapled, listing violations he supposedly committed overnight. Unauthorized construction noise, disruption of community tranquility, improper storage of construction material on HOA property, HOA property. The phrase was underlined 3 times, as if repetition alone could make it true. He crumpled the notice in his fist and let his eyes drift to the lake. The water glimmered a pale silver under the morning sun, as if trying to stay neutral in a fight it had seen many times before. His phone buzzed, a single text from Sheriff Nolan Briggs. "Heard they're starting early. Call if anything gets out of hand." That alone told him more than any report. The sheriff had seen this pattern before. An HOA backed into a corner didn't negotiate. It suffocated. Elias turned at the rumble of engines. 2 SUVs crawled down the old gravel road, their black tires spitting dust like an approaching dust storm. They slowed, not to a stop, but a deliberate, crawling pace, just enough for the tinted windows to tilt toward him. Watching, recording, intimidating. The SUVs lingered at the edge of his property line before rolling forward in a slow, looping circle, turning back up the hill like vultures circling a wounded animal. He watched until they vanished behind the rise of the pines. "Harassment season," he muttered to himself, rubbing the back of his neck. "Right on schedule." He went back inside to unpack, but a knock on the door stopped him. A fast, impatient rhythm. 3 hits, a pause, 2 hits. He recognized the kind of knock used by people who think the world owes them answers. He opened the door to find a man in a neon green vest holding a clipboard to his chest like armor. His smile was too wide, too rehearsed. "Morning, sir." The man's tone was an imitation of cheerfulness that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm with Pine Hollow Lakeside Inspections. We've had complaints of environmental interference on your property." Elias stared. "Complaints from who?" The man cleared his throat, flipping the top sheet. "The HOA." Of course. Elias stepped aside but didn't invite him in. "You see any environmental interference from out here?" The inspector hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, I need to verify possible leaking, hazardous storage, or what?" Elias asked calmly. "Or the HOA will keep calling until someone checks a box?" The man blinked rapidly. His face reddened. I just have to follow the checklist." "Then follow away," Elias said, stepping forward so the inspector had to take a step back. "But you're not setting foot inside unless you have a county-issued warrant." The inspector swallowed hard. "No warrant, sir." "Then I'll save you time. Everything here is up to environmental standards. I worked dam compliance for 15 years. I know the law better than the HOA knows how to spell it." The inspector hesitated. Then finally, he nodded. I'm sorry. They told me you refused to cooperate. I'll mark the complaint unresolved." He climbed into his truck and drove off so quickly the tires spit gravel. Elias stood on the porch, the cold wind threading through his hair. The lake shimmered again, but this time the water felt watchful, like it was absorbing every detail of the morning. He finally sat on the steps, elbows resting on his knees, trying to trace the logic of the HOA's assault. Why the sudden urgency? Why the fake map? Why this obsessive attempt to claim jurisdiction over one old lodge? His thoughts were interrupted by another car, a minivan this time, creeping down the road. A woman leaned out the window as she passed, her expression apologetic. "Sorry about them," she called softly. "HOA's been intense lately." Her voice dropped. "Watch yourself, mister." The van rolled on, leaving Elias staring after it, a deeper understanding settling into his chest. This wasn't just an HOA overstepping. This was an HOA afraid. By noon, 3 more violation notices littered his porch. One taped to the window. One weighted on the doormat with a rock. One stuck under the windshield wiper of his truck. They accused him of everything from unauthorized shoreline alteration to improper vehicle parking. He read each one slowly, carefully, looking for patterns, mistakes, anything sloppy that might reveal the hand behind them. The language was inconsistent, the signatures mismatched, and some citations referenced non-existent HOA bylaws. Sloppy, rushed, desperate. He kept every page, stacking them neatly inside an old wooden box he found in the lodge pantry. He labeled the lid, Evidence, HOA Harassment. The act felt oddly grounding. As the afternoon sun dipped low, the wind shifted cold across the lake, stirring ripples across the surface. Elias stepped down to the dock, letting the worn boards creak beneath him. A gull drifted overhead. The air carried the scent of lake water and damp pine needles. He crouched and brushed his fingers along the wood grain, searching for answers in the grain and shadows. Something still felt wrong. Something beneath all the noise and accusations. Loose gravel crunched behind him. "Figured I'd find you down here," Sheriff Briggs said, stepping onto the clearing. His brown jacket looked heavier than usual, and the lines around his eyes deepened with the weight of knowing too much. "You hear about the notices?" Elias asked. "I hear about everything around here," Briggs replied, "especially when that board starts stirring up dust." Elias studied him. "You know why they're targeting this place?" Briggs kicked at a pebble with his boot. "I know patterns when I see them. HOA's been pushing their limits all year, extending boundaries where they don't belong, slapping fines on folks hoping they'll sell under pressure." "Why this lodge?" Elias pressed. The sheriff looked toward the lake, his jaw tightening. "Because your shoreline is strategic. Always has been. They want it. And they're not used to being told no." The wind rose again, tossing a spray of cold mist along the dock. Elias felt it sting his face, sharp as a warning. "What exactly are they afraid I'll discover?" he asked softly. Sheriff Briggs didn't answer. He just sighed, the sound carrying the weight of a man who'd already said too much. "Be careful, Mercer. Folks around here hide their worst secrets in pretty places." The sheriff walked away, his steps fading into the pines, but his warning hung in the air like smoke. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge and shadows stretched long across Pine Hollow Lake, Elias stood alone on the dock, his jaw set, his breath steady. Whatever the HOA was hiding, whatever truth lay beneath forged boundaries, surveillance SUVs and late-night inspections, he would find it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the very thing they feared most. The next morning broke with the kind of crisp stillness that usually washed Pine Hollow Lake clean of worry. But not today. Elias stepped out onto the porch, boots landing on the cold planks, and knew immediately the air carried a different weight. Tight, dense, humming like a wire stretched too far. He followed the feeling down to the water's edge, drawn by an instinct sharpened over years of reading landscapes like open books. The lake was low that morning, lower than it had been in years. A thin band of dark earth peeked from under the dock beams, exposed by a dry spell sweeping across the valley. Elias crouched at the edge, the wooden boards sighing beneath him. Something metallic glinted beneath the shallow waves, flashing for just a heartbeat before the water rolled over it again. He eased himself lower, one hand gripping a support post. The lake smelled of moss and cold mud, the kind of earthy scent that carried memories with it. But beneath it, faint yet undeniable, was another smell, something like old oil and rusted steel. He narrowed his eyes and waited for the water to recede again. When it did, the sunlight caught the shape clearly. Steel. Not modern steel. Not the kind you'd find on a homeowner's dock or some store-bought reinforcement. This was old, thick, riveted, military-grade steel, anchored deep into the lakebed. Its edges were worn, almost swallowed by sediment, yet unmistakably artificial. It looked deliberate. Elias ran a hand through his hair. His grandfather never mentioned this. No one in town had. And yet here it was, beneath the shallow water, supporting the dock like a hidden spine. A whisper of movement behind him broke his focus. He turned to see Clara Pennington approaching from the tree line, her brown boots brushing fallen pine needles aside. A folder tucked beneath her arm, her breath puffing in white clouds. "I hope I didn't startle you," she said, stopping a few feet away. "You didn't," Elias replied, nodding at the folder. "That from the county?" She gave a small, worried nod. "You should see this." He stood and wiped the mud from his hands before taking the documents. He flipped through the papers. Black and white copies of old survey maps, faded deeds, handwritten notes, and annotations made by clerks long since retired or buried. "You found something," he murmured. Clara pointed to a circular seal stamped on one of the older documents. "This is the county's 1934 survey. Your grandfather's name is listed on every page. And this," she flipped to another sheet, "is the deed registering ownership of not only the lodge but the submerged land directly surrounding it." Elias felt the world tighten around him, the wind halting as though listening. "Submerged land?" "Yes." Clara's voice lowered, serious and steady. "Your grandfather owned the lake bottom on this side of Pine Hollow. Everything under the water from this point," she motioned toward the dock, "and stretching across the eastern half." Elias closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the revelation. "So the HOA," he began. "They don't own this shoreline," Clara finished. "Not legally, not historically. The boundary expansion they filed 10 days ago contradicts every archived record." The twist hit hard, sharper than he expected. He looked again at the steel structure beneath the water. "It explains why they wanted jurisdiction," he said. "Why they're desperate." Clara took a small step closer. "Elias, I've worked in that office for 6 years. I've seen HOAs push their limits. But this feels like someone trying to write history." He crouched again at the dock edge. The water lapped quietly, as if whispering its own secrets. The wind stirred a few pine needles loose, letting them drift down onto the lake's surface. "Why would they care about submerged land?" he asked. "It's not exactly prime real estate." Clara hesitated. "Unless the lake bottom affects something bigger. Water rights, access rights, dock permits, maybe even property values." "That steel down there," Elias said slowly, pointing. "You ever seen anything like it?" Clara crouched beside him, careful not to let her boots slip into the water. She peered down. Her breath caught. "That's not natural." "No," Elias said, "and it didn't get here by accident." He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. His pulse was steady, but a new awareness spread through him, like he had been looking at this lake through a window, and someone had just opened the door. Clara looked at him with quiet understanding. "If the HOA finds out you know this, they'll escalate," Elias finished. The wind pushed through the pines in a long, low sigh. A cloud drifted over the sun, casting the dock into cold shadow. Elias felt the shift, the temperature swinging down just enough to raise goosebumps beneath his flannel. He turned, scanning the tree line, and saw another SUV parked far up the hill, not moving, not approaching, simply watching. From behind the windshield, A camera lens shimmered in the sun. Elias squinted. The SUV didn't move. Clara followed his stare. "They've been driving around since sunrise," she whispered, "like they're waiting for something. Or watching for something." He met her eyes. "They know I'm close." Clara swallowed. "Elias, you need to be careful. If this submerged land deed is accurate, you don't just own a shoreline. You own control points the HOA depends on." "And that," Elias said, "gives them every reason to want me gone." He gathered the documents, tucking them carefully into his jacket. He felt the paper like a pulse against his chest. Proof. Truth. Leverage. The lodge stood behind him, sturdy as ever, its dark windows mirroring the lake as if absorbing every moment. Clara gave a small nod, her voice steady even as the wind picked up. "I'll keep digging. There's more in those archives. I can feel it." He nodded back. "And I'll keep my eyes open." She turned and disappeared into the pines, her silhouette fading into the shifting shadows. The sun broke through the clouds again, glinting off the steel beneath the water. Elias stood alone at the edge of the dock, the waves soft and rhythmic against the beams. But the calm didn't reach him. Not now. Not with this new knowledge. This wasn't just about an overreaching HOA. This was about inherited authority buried beneath decades of water and silence. And as he stared at the hidden structure below, a thought surfaced with chilling clarity. If his family once controlled this land, and the lake beneath it, then someone had been hiding that truth for a long, long time. And they weren't going to give it up quietly. The wind came in sharp, rolling down from the ridgeline as Elias climbed the slope from the dock. By the time he stepped onto the lodge porch, the first thing he noticed was the new notice taped to the front door, bright as a wasp and just as unwelcome. The second thing he noticed was the SUV idling at the end of his gravel drive, its engine rumbling low like a growl waiting to be released. He peeled the notice off with 2 fingers. "Demolition warning. Structural hazard," it read in bold, blocky letters. Below it, a neatly typed paragraph claimed the lodge's foundation was a danger to the community, with a deadline to vacate or face forced compliance. He let out a breath that was half a laugh, half disbelief. They weren't even pretending to be subtle anymore. Before he could step inside, footsteps crunched on the gravel. He turned toward the sound. 3 figures approached, Madeline Stroud in front, flanked by 2 board members he hadn't met yet. They marched like a trio of judges arriving to deliver a verdict. Madeline wore a heavy wool coat and an even heavier expression, the kind of look someone used when they believed authority was sewn into their jacket lining. She carried another clipboard, and Elias already knew whatever form was attached wasn't going to be friendly. "Mr. Mercer," she called out, voice sharp enough to cut the cold air in half. "We have serious concerns about the structural integrity of your property." "Good morning to you too," Elias replied. "You're ignoring repeated notices," she said, arriving at the steps with a storm in her eyes, "and refusing to comply with community standards." "I'm not part of your community," Elias reminded her. "This lodge predates your HOA. Everything on this side of the lake falls under HOA oversight," she snapped. "Environmental management, safety standards, property maintenance, jurisdiction you acquired 10 days ago through forged boundary expansions," Elias said evenly. Her lips tightened like she'd tasted something bitter. The board members behind her shifted their weight, suddenly unsure. Madeline cleared her throat. "Those filings were legal and binding. Our legal team reviewed them." Elias didn't blink. "Then your legal team needs a new set of eyes." Her posture stiffened. "Mr. Mercer, this isn't a debate. We're here to assess the structural risks your lodge presents. You are required to grant access to our contracted inspectors." Elias crossed his arms. "No warrant, no entry." Madeline's face twitched, just enough to crack the veneer of calm she tried to maintain. "You're obstructing an HOA investigation." And you, Elias replied, are trespassing. One of the board members, a balding man with a nervous habit of touching his wedding ring, shifted uneasily. Madeline, maybe we should contact county. She shot him a glare that could have frozen the lake. He fell silent instantly. Elias stepped down 2 porch steps, standing at her level, meeting her stare with an engineer's steady patience. You don't want the county involved, he said, because the moment they start digging, those maps you filed are going to raise questions you can't answer. Madeline's jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped beneath her cheek. Her eyes flickered toward the lake, just for a moment, but it was enough. Enough to reveal what she didn't want him to know, that the truth wasn't on land, it was underwater. She straightened. If you refuse entry, we'll mark your non-compliance as willful and issue daily fines. Elias shrugged. Add them to the stack. I've been collecting them. Her nose flared. This is not a game, Mr. Mercer. No, Elias said quietly. It's not, and you're losing. Her composure finally cracked. The board members had to step back as frustration radiated off her. You think you understand what you're dealing with, she said, voice trembling slightly. But you don't. This lodge, this shore, this entire east side of the lake is vital to Pine Hollow. If you interfere with operations... Operations? Elias interrupted. What operations require forged documents and midnight surveillance? Her expression froze. The board members exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances. You're making a mistake, she whispered. A very big mistake. Before Elias could reply, the distant crunch of heavy tires rolled across the clearing. Sheriff Nolan Briggs stepped out of his truck, his boots sinking softly into the dirt. His brow furrowed the moment he saw the group. Everything all right here? He asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd walked into this kind of storm more times than he wished. Madeline turned toward him with a carefully manufactured smile. Sheriff, we're conducting official HOA business. Briggs gave her the kind of slow, unimpressed stare that could peel paint off a barn. Funny thing, he said. HOA business doesn't override county law. Madeline's smile faltered. Sheriff, this property is under Elias Mercer's legal ownership, Briggs finished. I checked the filings this morning. Original deed, verified. The board members froze. Madeline turned pale beneath her foundation. Elias caught the smallest tremor of fear in her expression, buried deep but unmistakable. Briggs walked closer, placing himself between Elias and the HOA trio. His voice was calm but edged with iron. If you folks intend to keep setting foot on this property, I'm going to need formal documentation, not copies, originals, signed and notarized. Madeline opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. This is irregular. No, Briggs said. What's irregular is filing jurisdiction maps after hours using a clerk portal meant for internal auditing. Clara's quiet whistle of truth from the county office had clearly reached his ears. Madeline stiffened. Sheriff, you're overstepping. He leaned in slightly. Ma'am, if I was overstepping, you'd know. Silence fell like a sheet of ice spreading across the lake. Madeline inhaled sharply, then flicked her hand in dismissal to the board members. We're leaving, she spat, turning on her heel. They followed her in a jittery retreat, walking fast, boots crunching on the gravel until they reached the SUV. The engine revved, dirt sprayed. Then they vanished back up the winding road. Briggs watched them disappear, then turned to Elias. They're cornered, the sheriff said. And cornered folks make mistakes. Elias nodded slowly. They already have. The sheriff stared out at the lake, hands on his hips. Just be ready. This isn't the end of it. I know, Elias replied, but I'm not backing down. Briggs gave a small nod of respect, then walked back to his truck. As the engine faded into the distance, Elias stood alone again, this time with a new feeling tightening in his chest, a mix of pressure and resolve. He stepped back toward the dock, the boards groaning under his weight. The lake was glass still, holding secrets just below the surface, reflecting a sky that seemed to grow darker by the minute. Whatever the HOA was fighting for wasn't small. It wasn't petty. It was something structural, something concealed, something worth forging documents to protect. And Elias had just forced their hand. Their next move wouldn't be subtle. It would be reckless, desperate. The wind hissed across the water like a whispered warning. Whatever came next, the real fight was about to begin. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered across Pine Hollow Lake like a wool blanket pulled tight over the sky. A low hum of distant thunder rolled along the valley, though no lightning followed. The wind pressed against the lodge windows in jittery bursts, rattling the loose panes the way a restless hand taps on a desk. Elias spent the daylight hours reinforcing the porch steps and sorting through the documents Clara had given him, spreading them across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle still missing several edges. The lodge settled around him with familiar old house sounds, wood expanding and contracting with the temperature, the soft thump of a shutter catching wind, the faint gurgle of plumbing deep in the walls. But as dusk bled into night, those comforting noises were replaced by something else, a kind of alertness, a stiffness in the air. Or maybe that was just him. He stepped onto the porch with his coffee mug in hand, the rich smell of roasted beans mixing with the sharper scent of incoming rain. The lake below was unnervingly still, quiet enough that he could hear the tiny splashes of minnows near the reeds, too quiet for a night that carried the weight of a storm. Then came the sound. Gravel shifting, slow, deliberate, like feet trying not to be heard. Elias set his mug down gently, every sense sharpened like a tightened bolt. He walked to the edge of the porch and listened, the cold air biting at his cheeks. There it was again, closer now. He moved down the steps, boots silent as he crossed the damp earth. The faint scent of diesel drifted through the air, carried by the shifting wind. He rounded the side of the lodge, keeping his steps careful, controlled. Two figures crouched beside the dock, flashlights in hand, beams angled low. Their silhouettes jerked and shifted like they were measuring something, tape lines glinting faintly. One man knelt at the water's edge, scraping what looked like a ruler against the wooden beams. The other took photos, the shutter clicks sharp as snapping twigs. Board members. The same men who'd flanked Madeline earlier. Elias walked forward until he was close enough for the earth to crunch beneath his boots. "You fellas misplaced your scents tonight?" The men froze. One nearly dropped his flashlight. The other, mid-photo, snapped another picture out of pure shock. We're performing a safety inspection," the taller one stammered. "At midnight?" Elias asked. "After a complaint?" the shorter man blurted. "HOA policy allows—" "No," Elias cut in. "Policy doesn't allow trespassing." The taller man puffed his chest, trying to salvage authority. "We can be here. This is HOA property." Elias didn't have to raise his voice. He just let silence stretch long enough to become uncomfortable. "Would you like to try that sentence again?" We received a directive," the shorter man said, voice faltering. "From Mrs. Stroud." "Of course." Before Elias could respond, headlights flashed through the trees, bright, white, cutting across the dark like a blade. Tires rolled across gravel. A familiar engine thrum. Sheriff Nolan Briggs climbed out of his cruiser, his hat pulled low, coat flapping in the rising wind. "What in the world are you boys doing?" Briggs asked, walking toward them with the slow, measured steps of a man who already knew the answer and was giving them a chance to backpedal. "Official HOA business, Sheriff," the taller man replied. "We're, gathering evidence." "Evidence for what?" Briggs asked. "It's the middle of the night, and this property—" He pointed at Elias, then at the ground. "Is not yours to assess." The men exchanged panicked glances. The shorter one's flashlight flickered as his hands shook. "Sheriff, we didn't... This wasn't..." Briggs sighed. "Get off the property before I write you up for trespass." They didn't argue. They didn't negotiate. They didn't even walk. They scrambled, grabbing their equipment with messy hands before rushing up the hill toward a dark sedan tucked between the pines. The engine revved loud and angry, spitting gravel as it tore away. Only when the taillights vanished did the sheriff turn toward Elias. "This is escalating faster than I thought," Briggs said. His voice carried the weight of 12 winters and 100 small-town disputes. But this one was bigger. "They're not bold enough to try that unless they're afraid of losing something big." Elias nodded. "I figured as much." Briggs gestured toward the water. "You find anything unusual down there?" Elias studied the sheriff carefully. "Maybe." Briggs gave a long exhale, letting the wind take the breath out over the lake. "Listen, Mercer. HOA's been sniffing around this shoreline for years, trying to buy it, redraw it, stake claims. Nobody ever understood why. Folks thought it was just about convenience. Pretty view. Maybe a future clubhouse. But it's not," Elias said. "It's about control." Briggs gave him a slow, meaningful nod. "They need your land to guarantee their lake access. Without it, their property values tank. The whole east side collapses." Elias frowned. "So all this? Fines? Trespassing? Fake notices?" "Pressure," Briggs said. "Make you sell cheap, or scare you into leaving." "But the forged map," Elias pressed. "Why now?" Briggs looked toward the dark tree line where the board members had fled. "Because they knew you were coming." Word spreads fast in Pine Hollow. Someone saw the probate filing. Someone realized you were inheriting more than a lodge. "It's not the building they want," Elias murmured. "It's what sits beneath it." The sheriff didn't ask what he meant. Maybe he already had a guess. Maybe he didn't want to know. A gust of wind swept across the valley then, sending ripples racing across the lake. The water reflected the moon in broken shards, trembling like shaken glass. Above them, clouds gathered thick and heavy, promising rain before dawn. Briggs stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You need to stay sharp, Mercer. They're not going to back off. Not after tonight." Elias nodded once. "I wasn't expecting them to." Briggs adjusted his hat. "You get any more visitors tonight? Call me. And don't handle this alone." The sheriff walked back to his cruiser, the red brake lights painting the trees as he left. When the engine faded, Elias remained on the dock, the boards cool beneath his boots. The lake seemed restless now, the wind pulling at its surface like fingers scratching at a locked door. The steel reinforcement beneath the water glimmered faintly with each ripple. He crouched again, staring at the shadowy shape buried in mud. A structure, a secret, something meant to stay hidden. He rose slowly, breath steady, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Tonight, the HOA crossed a line. They made their mistake, and he was done waiting. The truth was down there, resting beneath layers of water, silt, and time. And Elias Mercer was going to bring it to the surface. The storm that threatened all evening finally arrived in the early hours before sunrise. Rain hammered the lake in slanted sheets, drumming on the lodge's tin roof and rattling loose shingles. Lightning flared behind the ridge once, twice, but never close enough to break the darkness. Elias sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning low, the rest of the lodge lit only by the intermittent glow of the storm. Spread in front of him were maps, dozens of them. Old surveys from the 1900s, topographic charts from the 1940s, and the recent forged HOA boundary filings. Each document told part of a story, but not the one Madeline Stroud wanted the world to believe. Elias traced his finger across the authentic 1934 survey line. The ink faded but legible. His grandfather's name sat stamped in the corner. Mercer Tract, shoreline and submerged land rights. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a myth. It was the law. He leaned back, rubbing tiredness from his eyes, when a sharp knock echoed through the lodge, firm, rhythmic, unmistakable. He set the documents aside and opened the door just as a gust of wet wind swept across the porch. Derek Hall, land attorney, stepped inside, shaking off rain from his coat. The storm had soaked him nearly to the bone, but he carried his briefcase as if it were the only thing that couldn't get wet. "You picked a fine night to ask me here," Derek grumbled, kicking mud from his boots. "Reminds me of the flood cases I handled back in Wyoming. Never saw a storm that didn't bring trouble with it." Elias motioned to the table. "This trouble showed up before the rain." Derek set his briefcase down and opened it with a click. "All right, show me what you've got." Elias laid out the archived survey maps and deed copies Clara had brought. Derek adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the pages with the practiced precision of a man who'd spent his life arguing property law before judges who couldn't care less. After several minutes, Derek gave a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. This is authentic. The deed, the survey stamps, the notary mark, it's all legally binding." "Meaning?" Elias asked. "Meaning you don't just own the lodge," Derek said, tapping the central survey with his finger. "You own the lake bed beneath the east half of Pine Hollow. Every dock, every buoy, every underwater support beam sits on your property." Elias exhaled slowly. "And the HOA?" "Has no claim," Derek said. "None. Their boundary expansion is worthless. They forged jurisdiction over land they never had. Worse, they built their entire enforcement system around your shoreline." The storm thundered outside, shaking the window panes. Elias nodded toward the map. Why would they risk forging something this bold? Derek leaned back, folding his arms. "Picture this. Homeowners buy million-dollar waterfront property. They want docks, boat lifts, shoreline access. HOAs survive on dues tied to those privileges. But if those structures sit on land they don't own, and the real owner shows up, everything collapses," Elias murmured. "Exactly," Derek said. "Without the shore access, property values drop like stones. They'd lose political power, funding, control. Madeline Stroud isn't just fighting for pride. She's fighting for the HOA's survival." A gust of wind slammed into the lodge, rattling the metal gutters like chains. Elias stared at the steel structure he'd seen under the water earlier. A forgotten remnant. Old. Deep. Connected. "So what's the play?" he asked. Derek smiled, a small, knowing grin of a man holding the winning cards. "We take your nail, and we hit them with the hammer. But we do it loudly, publicly, and where every homeowner hears it." "The HOA meeting?" Elias guessed. "Exactly. Monthly assembly, open to all residents. They'll expect you to show up and be bullied. Instead, you're going to walk in with the documents they can't challenge." Elias felt a shift in the lodge, like the beams above him were leaning in to listen. "And if they try to deny it?" he asked. Derek tapped the old deed again. "State law is on your side. This deed predates every HOA attempt. It supersedes any later filings. Their entire jurisdiction crumbles the moment this touches a projector screen." Elias stared at the yellowed paper. Its edges were fragile, soft with age, but the power it held was undeniable. Generations of Mercer hands had touched this document, and now it was the key to stopping an HOA that had operated unchecked for too long. "When's the meeting?" Elias asked. "Tomorrow night," Derek replied. 7 p.m. at the Pine Hollow Community Hall. Elias nodded slowly. "Then that's where we end this." The storm outside grew heavier, the rain hitting harder, as if nature itself wanted to punctuate the moment. Derek began packing the documents carefully into waterproof sleeves. "One more thing," he said. "You need to be prepared. When people lose control, they panic, and panic makes them dangerous." Elias gave a tired smile. Sheriff Briggs said the same thing. "Good man," Derek replied. "Listen to him." Lightning lit the room briefly, illuminating the spray of old papers across the table. The lodge groaned with the weight of the storm, the boards flexing and settling like an old ship riding out rough seas. Elias drank in the quiet that followed, feeling it settle into his bones. The third knot had been pulled tight. The truth was on his side. But nothing about tomorrow would be peaceful. He rolled the deed back into its protective sleeve, sealing it shut. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "they learn they built their kingdom on my land." Derek closed his briefcase. "You ready for that?" Elias looked out at the lake, where faint glimmers of steel still lurked beneath the storm-torn surface. "I've been ready since the moment they stepped on my dock." The wind howled in response, bending the pines and sending needles skittering across the porch. Tomorrow would be the turning point. Tomorrow, the HOA would face the truth they'd buried beneath forged documents and intimidation. And Elias Mercer would bring that truth into the light. The day of the HOA meeting dawned with a deceptive calm. The storm had passed, leaving Pine Hollow Lake washed clean, its surface glittering under the early sun, like nothing dangerous had ever touched it. The pines shook droplets from their branches, scattering light in fractured patterns across the lodge windows. For a moment, the world seemed almost peaceful, but Elias felt the tension beneath it. A quiet before a battle, a lake holding its breath again. He spent the morning organizing the documents Derek had left, including the 1934 deed, laying them out on the wooden dining table, each page carefully arranged in the order he planned to reveal them. His engineer's discipline kept him focused, but every so often he glanced toward the shoreline, half expecting another SUV to crawl down his drive with urgent violations. None came, which worried him more. By noon, he headed into town to meet Derek. Pine Hollow's main road was lined with thick old trees that formed a sort of protective canopy, but even they couldn't hide the sideways glances from townsfolk who stood outside the bakery, the hardware store, the post office. Rumors traveled faster than cars in a place like this. He parked outside Pine Hollow Community Hall, a weathered cedar building with a rustic metal roof and a wooden sign carved decades ago. The hall had stood through storms, elections, weddings, and disputes, but never a confrontation like the one brewing tonight. Derek Hall was already waiting inside, a portable projector set up beside the podium. He lifted a hand in greeting as Elias entered. "You bring everything?" Derek asked. "Every page," Elias said, patting the worn satchel slung over his shoulder. "If they try to argue, we'll drown them in their own paperwork." "That's the spirit," Derek replied with a grin, though the slight edge in his voice made it clear he knew trouble could still come. They ran through the plan twice, then a third time when Sheriff Briggs stopped in. Briggs leaned on the back wall with arms crossed, examining the room like a man scanning a forest for hidden predators. "Expect a full house tonight," he said. "Word is Stroud has been rallying the homeowners, scaring them with talk of losing lake access." "That true?" Elias asked. "It could be," Briggs replied, "if your deed stands, and it will." He gave Elias a nod of confidence. But they don't know that yet. By sunset, a long line of SUVs and sedans wound down the hill toward the hall. People spilled into the parking lot, their conversations carried by the cool breeze that swept in from the lake. Nervous energy moved through the crowd like static electricity. Some residents looked curious, some frustrated, others flat out angry. Elias and Derek took their seats at the back until the meeting officially started. Madeline Stroud stood at the front, polished as ever, wearing a charcoal suit and a smile as thin as a razor. She tapped the microphone twice, sending a sharp echo through the hall. "Good evening, homeowners," she said. We've convened tonight to address a serious threat to the integrity of Pine Hollow Lakeside community. Elias felt dozens of eyes shift his direction. The trap had been set. Madeline continued, "As many of you know, an individual has taken residence in a structure previously abandoned, and it was never abandoned," Elias said quietly. Her eyes snapped toward him, but she forced her composure back like a mask stitched too tight. "And has since refused all HOA oversight, violated construction rules, and blocked environmental inspections." Murmurs rose from the crowd. Derek gave Elias a nod. Time. Elias stood slowly, the satchel over his shoulder. As he walked down the center aisle toward the podium, the room fell into an uneasy hush. Madeline's smile faltered, but she didn't step aside. "Mrs. Stroud," Elias said calmly, "before you continue telling this story your way, I'd like to present some information." "This is not your floor," Madeline snapped. Derek rose behind him. "With respect, it is. Mr. Mercer is responding to accusations made publicly and recorded in the HOA minutes." A ripple of whispers moved through the hall. Madeline's jaw tightened, but the board members beside her shifted uneasily. She stepped aside, though her glare could have peeled bark off a pine. Elias set his satchel down and pulled out the first document, the aged 1934 survey map. He placed it under the projector camera. The large screen behind him flickered to life, the old ink and faded outlines filling the room like a ghost resurrected. "This," Elias began, "is the original survey of Pine Hollow Lake's eastern shoreline. Stamped, filed, notarized. It documents the legal boundaries of the Mercer Tract, including ownership of submerged land." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Madeline stepped forward. "These documents are old. They're irrelevant. They are the law," Elias said firmly. He placed the next documents on the projector. Deed copies, signatures, historical certificates. One after another, the evidence painted a picture so clear even the most skeptical homeowner felt the weight of truth settle over the room. "You built your docks," Elias continued, "your lifts, your private slips, on my underwater property." The silence that followed was heavy, cold, a lake with no wind. Madeline barked a laugh, too loud for the room. "Forgery, clearly! Anyone can print out ancient-looking papers." Derek stepped to the podium, holding a sealed envelope. "Actually, these were authenticated by the county office this morning. Clara Pennington signed off personally." The tension crackled like static before a lightning strike. This was the explosion in the emotional rhythm, sudden, undeniable. Elias reached into his satchel once more, pulling out the final sheet, the HOA's forged boundary map. "If you still doubt who's lying," he said softly, "look at this." He projected the forged map beside the original 1934 survey. The contrast was stunning. Even a child could see the discrepancies. Lines that didn't match. Boundaries shifted. Signatures that weren't the same. Homeowners erupted in confused shouts. "What is this? You said we owned the shore." "Madeline, explain." Faces turned toward the HOA president like a tide pulling in one direction. Madeline's skin flushed red, then pale, then a mottled combination of both. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her board members stepped away from her as if her guilt were contagious. Elias took a breath, steady and controlled. "I didn't come here to fight. I came here to bring the truth. And this," he gestured toward the screen, "is the truth." The hall fell into a stunned, trembling silence. The emotional arc of the room had shifted entirely. Madeline no longer faced Elias. She faced her own homeowners, and she had nothing left to stand on. The cliffhanger formed naturally, hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. If this wasn't HOA land, if everything they'd built rested on someone else's property, then what would happen next? The question hung in the air like the echo of a slammed door, rattling through the Pine Hollow Community Hall. For a moment, no one moved. The lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow across rows of stunned homeowners whose expressions ranged from confusion to outright panic. The air grew tight, thick with the kind of fear that comes from realizing the ground you've stood on for decades might never have been yours. Madeline Stroud stood frozen at the podium, knuckles white around her clipboard, eyes darting between the projected maps as if they might rearrange themselves into something less damning. Her lipstick looked smudged now, her confidence unraveling in real time. Elias let the silence linger exactly long enough for the weight of the truth to settle. Then he reached into his satchel one last time. "You want proof of intent?" he said softly. "Here it is." The homeowners leaned forward collectively as Elias placed the HOA's forged boundary maps onto the projector. This time, he didn't stop at the redrawn lines. He clicked to a second page, one Clara had slipped him earlier. A portal access log, time-stamped. User ID registered to M. Stroud. Gasps surged across the room. Someone stood up in the second row. "You filed that?" Another voice erupted. "You said the county approved it." Then a third, shakier, older. "I trusted you." Madeline swallowed, her throat tightening visibly. "This is a misunderstanding," she croaked. "Someone used my credentials. No one else has your login," Derek Hall cut in, stepping forward. "County IT verified it this morning, and your signature appears on the notarization, copied from a previous document." Madeline's composure snapped like a branch in winter. "This is ridiculous. He's manipulating you all. You don't know what he's hiding." Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The only thing I've been hiding," he said, "is patience." He stepped back as the crowd erupted again. The board members shifted away from Madeline, as if proximity might make them accessories. Homeowners clutched their phones, snapping photos of the projected map, whispering furiously. This wasn't just embarrassment. It was betrayal. And betrayal carried a much sharper edge than inconvenience. Sheriff Nolan Briggs stood at the side of the hall, his hat tucked under his arm, expression stony. As the noise reached a fever pitch, he stepped toward the front, boots echoing against the wooden floor. Without raising his voice, he cleared his throat. The room fell silent, instantly. "Folks," Briggs said, looking over the crowd, "I've seen a lot of things in this county. Land disputes, water rights battles, neighbors feuding over fences. But what I see here tonight, this is different." He turned toward Madeline. "Mrs. Stroud, I need you to answer for this filing." Madeline recoiled. "Sheriff, this is a private meeting." "No," Briggs said firmly. "This became a county issue when you falsified a public record." That sentence dropped like a stone into deep water. Elias saw it ripple through every face in the room. Madeline sputtered, her words fraying at the edges. I only did what was necessary. You don't understand. If he owns the shoreline, our lake access, our property values, our entire community is built on land that isn't yours," Elias finished quietly. "And instead of finding a lawful solution, you chose fraud, intimidation, forged notices, and trespassing." Her jaw trembled. "I was protecting Pine Hollow." "Protecting it?" a homeowner shouted. "You put all of us at risk." "My father bought his house because you promised permanent lake access," another called. "Our docks on his land?" a woman whispered, horrified. "All these years?" Elias stepped aside as the crowd surged again, the wooden hall filling with a roar of anger, disbelief, and fear. It wasn't chaos. It was the sound of trust collapsing. He waited. Then Derek Hall placed a final document on the projector, a certified county investigation notice bearing a fresh seal. "This," Derek announced, "is the official statement from the county clerk's office. Effective immediately, Pine Hollow Lakeside HOA is under investigations for filing fraudulent jurisdiction expansions, issuing unlawful fines, and misrepresenting property rights to its members." Madeline staggered back, gripping the podium as if it were the last solid thing beneath her feet. And Derek continued, all enforcement powers are suspended until the investigation concludes. Homeowners gasped. For some, the reaction was relief. For others, fear of what happened next. Without the HOA's authority, lake access agreements, dock permits, and long-held property assumptions lay in limbo. Briggs stepped closer to Madeline. Mrs. Stroud, I'm going to need you to remain available for questioning. Don't leave town. Madeline sank into her chair, shoulders slumped, staring at nothing. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Elias waited until the noise settled, then stepped to the microphone. Not to boast, not to twist the knife, but because the room needed to hear the truth from the person they'd nearly lost everything to fight. Everyone, he said calmly, I'm not here to destroy your homes. I'm not here to take your docks or ruin your lake access. Eyes lifted toward him, worried, hopeful, uncertain. I inherited this lodge. I didn't ask for power over your side of the lake, but I won't let anyone steal what my family legally owns, and I won't let forged papers dictate the truth. A silence grew, thick, expectant. Elias let it settle before adding, there's a legal path forward, but it starts with honesty, something the HOA chose to abandon. He stepped back. The room weighed his words for a long moment. Then Bentley Carr, the oldest homeowner in Pine Hollow, stood with the help of his cane. His voice cracked slightly as he said, Son, what happens to us now? Elias looked around the hall, at the anxious faces illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. That depends, he answered, on what we decide together after the investigation. But one thing's certain, this community deserves better than forged boundaries and threats. Briggs nodded in agreement. Derek closed the projector. The emotional tide had shifted again, shock settling into a somber quiet. A room holding its breath, waiting for whatever tomorrow would bring. And outside, Pine Hollow Lake lay dark and glassy under a rising moon, silent witness to a truth finally brought above the waterline. The next morning arrived with a hush that felt almost reverent. No trucks on the gravel road. No HOA SUVs circling like vultures. No clipboard soldiers marching down his dock. Pine Hollow Lake stretched calm and silver under a pale sky, the mountains in the distance rising like quiet guardians. Elias stood on the edge of his porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching sunlight touch the water in slow, golden strokes. It should have felt peaceful. It almost did. But the fallout from last night still lingered in the valley like driftwood after a storm. By mid-morning, word had spread across town, through texts, porch conversations, and whispers in the diner. The HOA was suspended. Madeline Stroud faced a county investigation, and the shoreline of Pine Hollow Lake had a new reality. The man on the hill, the quiet engineer who inherited a lodge, now held the lake's most powerful legal position. Some residents arrived at his property before noon, not to confront him, those days seemed over, but to understand what would come next. The first was Bentley Carr, leaning heavily on his cane, hat tipped low. "Morning, son," he called out from the driveway. "Figure maybe we ought to talk." Elias nodded and walked down to meet him. The old man's face was etched with worry, the kind that came not from fear of punishment, but from fear of uncertainty. "You ain't here to take our docks, are you?" Bentley asked, voice soft, tired. "No, sir," Elias said. "That's not why I came." Bentley exhaled shakily, relief washing over him like a tide. "Good. Folks around here, we don't got a lot left if we lose the lake." "I know," Elias replied. "And I'm not here to punish anyone who did nothing wrong." Bentley nodded, patted Elias's shoulder, and shuffled back toward his truck, comforted more by that one conversation than by any official letter ever sent by the HOA. More homeowners arrived in small waves. A couple with twins, a retired teacher, a widower who fished every morning, rain or shine. Each came with the same question, the same hope. What happens now? Elias answered each the same way. We'll fix this together, legally, fairly. By afternoon, Sheriff Nolan Briggs drove up, his truck fishtailing slightly in the soft dirt. He stepped out with a folder under his arm and a guarded expression. County's moving quick on this, Briggs said. Stroud's officially suspended pending fraud charges. Could be weeks, could be months, but she's done for now. Elias nodded. And the HOA? Frozen, Briggs said. No actions, no fines, no enforcement. Entire communities in limbo. People are scared, Elias said quietly. They are, Briggs replied. But they're looking to you now, whether you like it or not. He opened the folder and handed Elias the official county acknowledgement of property rights. This makes it formal. You're the legal owner of the submerged land. No dispute left standing. Elias folded the document carefully, the weight of it settling over him like a mantle he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the lake in swirls of amber and rose, Elias gathered the community at his dock. Word had already spread, and dozens of homeowners arrived, some standing on the shore, some sitting on coolers, others leaning against pickups. Children played by the water's edge, their laughter mixing with the gentle lap of waves. Elias stepped onto the end of the dock, the wood creaking under his boots, and cleared his throat. The crowd quieted. You all deserve to know what happens next, he began, voice steady, carrying easily across the water. I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm not here to replace the HOA with another version of control. A few heads nodded, anxious but listening. I know lake access is part of your lives, your families, your memories, your homes. So here's what I'm offering. He paused, letting the wind brush the words ahead of him. I'll grant permanent easements to every homeowner here, fair, affordable, and written in a way that no one, no HOA, no developer, no future owner, can ever take away. Gasps rose from the crowd, this time soft, hopeful, trembling with relief. A woman in the front wiped her eyes. A man whispered, "Thank God." Someone else clapped, then quickly stopped, embarrassed. But the emotion began spreading, warm and slow like sunrise across water. Any fees, Elias continued, will go toward restoring the lake and preserving it. Not into pockets, not into politics, into Pine Hollow. Bentley pushed himself up, gripping his cane. Bless you, son, he said, voice breaking. You did what that board never had the guts to do. Elias felt a knot loosen inside him, something tied tight since the day he arrived. As the group murmured with relief, Clara Pennington stepped forward from the back, offering a supportive smile. I'll help file everything, she said. Make it official. Derek nodded beside her. I'll draft the agreements, this time the right way. Even Sheriff Briggs's stern expression softened. Sometimes, he said quietly, the lake chooses the right owner. The crowd dispersed slowly as twilight deepened into night. Lanterns flickered on porches. Fireflies drifted above the reeds. Somewhere across the water, a loon cried, a long, echoing call that sounded like both mourning and blessing. Elias lingered on the dock long after the last homeowner walked away. The lake reflected the sky in a perfect mirror, stars shimmering across its surface like silver dust. He crouched, letting his hand skim the cool water. This place had fought him at every turn. Not the land itself, but the people who feared losing control of it. Yet in the end, the water had given him answers. The old deed, the buried steel, the boundaries etched in time. The lake had revealed the truth to him, and now it entrusted him with its future. Behind him, the lodge lights glowed warm through the windows. Ahead of him, Pine Hollow Lake stretched wide and calm, as if taking its first easy breath in years. For the first time since arriving, Elias felt peace. Not the quiet from before the storm, but a deeper, earned calm. A calm built on justice. He whispered into the still air. Turns out, owning the land under their docks was enough to sink the entire HOA. A gentle breeze drifted across the water in response, rippling the reflection of the stars. The lake wasn't hiding anymore, and neither was he. If you've ever stood your ground against someone who tried to take what's yours, drop a justice in the comments. And if you want more stories where truth wins out in the end, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be right here, bringing you the next fight worth watching.